Okay guys, in this video I'm going to try to take you through a quick review of this week's material so that we can all be on the same page and make sure we understand everything. Some of these images are out of order and you'll just have to kind of wait as we go through. There will be a little jumping around, but I'll try to minimize that. So this first one, I want you to hit pause and go through and try to answer what each one of those numbers are. Okay, number one is going to be the central canal, also known as the Haversian canal. The X on the red structure would be the central artery, and the X on the blue structure would be the central vein. Number two is pointing at a lacuna. 3 is an osteocyte. Number 4, which we can see here. Number 4, which we can see right through here. This is pointing at the concentric lamellae. Number 5, that is pointing at the caniculi. Those are those little eyelashes coming off the osteocyte. And then number 6 is pointing into the entire structure together. This entire system itself is an osteon. Okay, so again, push pause. All right, number 1 here, we can see the interstitial lamellae. Number 2, again, we see the concentric lamellae. Number 3 is this guy here. That is the outer thing that wraps around the entire bone. So that is the circumferential lamellae. Number 4 is pointing at the periosteum, and just so you remember, we have an outer layer and we have an inner layer of periosteum, and that's important for lecture. These little guys here aren't on our list, but these are known as Sharpie's fibers, and those are what hold it to the bone. Number 5 is pointing to the area where we would see spongy bone. And again, there's some other structures we can see, okay? Don't forget, we can also see that central canal or that Haversian canal, and we can also see the central artery on this here. So that's what this is here. That is the central artery, and this opening is a central canal. All right, we're gonna move the sacrum down at the near to the end of the video, so we're gonna skip this slide. Here we're looking at the first bone in your neck, which is C1, and we're gonna look at the characteristics of C1. C1 is also known as the atlas, right? So that's the technical name you would want to use on your lecture test. So what is this? What is this? We need to know what this is. We need to know what this is. So this will be number 4, that opening. And then we'll see the next structure in just a second. And then we also need to know what this is. Okay, so hit pause. Okay, so number 1 is our anterior arch, and we can tell it's the anterior arch because the anterior arch has much smaller space between the structure known as number 3, which is our lateral mass. Now back here, number 2 is our posterior arch. Look how big this space is. So you can tell the difference between anterior to posterior arches based on that space there. Number 4 is the transverse foramen. Remember, we only see those in the cervical spine, and that's where the vertebral artery will pass. Number 5 is going to be the transverse process. Okay, here we can see another structure right here under the posterior aspect of the lateral mass. And there's one on both sides. Okay, so what structure would that be? That's right, that is the sulcus for the vertebral artery. Just also to point out, hopefully you can kind of see that this shape right through here is kind of like a concave type shape. It's kind of like a skateboarding ramp. Just to note later when we talk about the occipital condyles and how those articulate. Okay, so again, what was this structure? Number 2. What is this? Number 3. And number 4, 5, 6. And I gave you all those answers on the previous slide. 1 is the sulcus for the vertebral artery, 2 is the anterior arch, 3 is the posterior arch, 4 is the lateral mass, 5 is the transverse foramen, 6 is the transverse process. This is C2. C2 is also known as what? That is the axis. That's the name we'd want to give on a test. And the major thing we need to know for C2 is really just the structure here, the odontoid process, which is what articulates with C1, also known as the dens. Now this is a big version of a cervical vertebra. So I'm going to number it. Okay, push pause. Number 1 is going to be the spinous process, but remember in the cervical vertebra, it's bifid spinous process. You can see it's kind of a snake-like tongue. 2 is the lamina. 3 is the superior articular facet. And remember, those are going to be at a 45-degree angle. Number 4 is the vertebral body. Number 5 is unique to the cervical vertebra and the first thoracic vertebra, which are the uncinate processes. We can also see a part of this structure here. That is going to be our transverse process. And remember, we said earlier, the transverse foramen is housing the vertebral artery. And so that's what we're seeing here is the vertebral artery passing through the transverse foramen. Okay, cervical vertebra again. These two are the same. I just wanted to show you a little difference. You see how this has that bifid structure and this one does not? But it still has this transverse foramen, so I know this is a cervical vertebra. That tells me that this is C7 because C7 does not have a bifid spinous process. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, that structure here. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and then of course, can't really see it too well, I'll do it right here. 9. Number 1 is vertebral body, 2 is the uncinate process, 3 is the pedicle, 4 is the transverse process, 5 is the transverse foramen, 6 is the central canal, also known as the spinal canal, 7 is the lamina, 8 is the spinous process, and you can see those same structures also on the other bone. Here I wanted to see the angle of that facet. So this is about a 45-degree angle. Okay, so about 45 degrees. So we can see that there. We can also note that there is a superior articular process here, and then of course there's an inferior articular process here. What was this structure here that connects the vertebral body to the posterior element? We'll just put number 1 on it. That is the pedicle. Okay. 2 here is the lamina. 3 here is the spinous process. Okay. So we'll say number 4. That is the inferior articular process, and pay attention to how they face. It's facing this way. But the superior articular process is going to face the other way. So we'll see that going this way. So note how they face. Okay, here we can see a lumbar vertebra, and here we can see a thoracic vertebra. And it's important to be able to tell the difference between the two. The thoracic vertebra is going to be shaped a little differently. It has these little bitty divots right through there on it. Okay, we'll just say that's number 1. Number 1 is the inferior demifacet, and number 2 is the superior demifacet, and that's what articulates with ribs. Here we can see the angle of the superior articular process. Remember, that's going to be about 60 degrees in the thoracic spine. The angle here is going to be straight up and down. Remember, the angle of the superior articular facet is going to be 90 degrees when we look at the lumbar spine, which is what we see there. Okay, of course, we can see this number here. That is our transverse process. You can see this here, 4. That is the lamina. 5, spinous process. 6 is the superior articular process. We can just barely see the inferior articular process. Of course, this guy right through here would be our vertebral body. Okay, here we see a good example of a disc. This is in the lumbar spine. We can see in the center where we would note the nucleus pulposus. And then in the lumbar spine, we have lots of these little layers that surround it. That is known as the annulus fibrosus. Okay. Okay, here we can see the intervertebral foramen. This is where the spinal nerve root would pass out. And we can see the borders of the intervertebral foramen here as well too. So make sure you take note of those. It's not necessarily relevant for lab, but we want to see that. Here we can see that central canal. Okay, here we can see that sacrum. We can see number 1 here. Let's see what else we can see. We can also see these openings. What are these openings called? We'll call that number 2. All right. We're also going to note this little structure down here at the end. Note that this would normally be separated. These two would not be here. There would actually be a disc at this showing that these are two separate anatomical structures. Okay, this part here, number 4, is this, pointing down to that, and number 5 up here. Okay, this would be kind of talking about it like here, so it kind of would look like this structure if we took it off to the side. Okay, so let's see, and then number, say 6 here. Okay, so number 1 is the sacral promontory. Number 2, these would be the ventral foramina because it's in the front. All right, number 3 is the coccyx, which is not part of the sacrum. Number 4 would be the apex of the sacrum, and number 5 would be the base. So number 5 is kind of like looking at it like this, and number 4 is kind of looking at this part here as an upside down pyramid. Number 6 is the sacral ala. All right, we can see these spinous processes right through here, but all these bones are fused together, right? So the first thing it makes right through here is known as the what? There's number 1. Then we see another one here, like a big line of things that have kind of fused together. And then we see another line right through here. Okay. We also see that there's kind of an opening down here. We don't see it super well, but there's an opening where essentially the central canal passes all the way through here and then it stops. So what would we call that? That'll be number 4. And the specific little pointy portions, they kind of look like a horn. We'll see those right through there. All right, and then we have this up here, number 6. All right, so number 1 is our median sacral crest. Number 2 is our intermediate sacral crest. Number 3 is our lateral sacral crest. Number 4, where that opens up, that is going to be the sacral hiatus. Number 5, where we see these little pointed things right through here at the end of the sacral hiatus, that is going to be the sacral cornu, which is another way of saying horn. Number 6 is going to be our superior articular facet. Okay, just taking a look back at this model real quick. Here, this is an example of compact bone. Remember, compact bone is super tightly packed together. We can see passing through the compact bone the perforating artery. So if you look right here, this artery that's passing through, this is known as our perforating artery. And it's passing through the perforating canal. If you turn this model over, you would actually see just the canal by itself. And let's see, the very first slide too, one thing to point out, we saw the compact bone. Remember here at number 5, this was the example of spongy bone. Also remember that this inner lining of what we see as the inside of the bone is where we would find the medullary cavity. So in here, normally there'd be a medullary cavity. And then remember that that inner lining essentially here, where it lines from where the compact bone is meeting the spongy bone, would also be known as our endosteum, okay? So also remember that. Now, there's a few things that were not on this review. I've tried to put as much as I could on here to help us. We want to make sure that you can identify the different types of bones because those could show up on your test as well too. Remember, those bone types are flat, short, long, irregular, and sesamoid, and then a Wormian bone. Okay, that should be it for this review. Hopefully this gives you a good leg up if you needed a quick review. Remember, if you want to, you can go through and you can just push mute so that you're not listening to anything I say, and then try to go through and identify everything. You can always pause the video anywhere you want to as well too.